So as you know, we're a UNESCO designation, and we have been since 2004. And I just want to take a quick moment to acknowledge Pat Northey, who just this past week retired from our board. So he's one of the founding members, worked for the last 20 years on the Biosphere Reserve Initiative, and many of you will know. So it's a pretty monumental change and shift for our organization to lose Pat off the board, but it's due, I guess, for him. Biosphere reserves exist internationally. There are 600 of them worldwide. There are 18 in the network in Canada that we partner with through a national office or a national board. Every single biosphere reserve worldwide is tasked with three functions: conservation of biological diversity, sustainable development, which we'll talk about, it's a rather nebulous concept, and then research and education, which UNESCO calls logistics support, which I don't like the term, so I call it research and education. That's pretty much what it is. The other thing that I think folks that may not know really well of is that UNESCO biosphere reserves on a landscape have a form which is three zones of land, which is core protected areas, which are typically your national and provincial parks, and in some cases, some of the GBLT lands would sort of comply with their requirements. And then ideally, in an ideal landscape ecology, you'd have a buffer habitat around those core protected areas, which we'd see a little bit more activity happening in them, but primarily those buffer habitats are there to protect core habitats. And then the transition areas where all of us live, recreate, and have our social and economic activities. And so really you're trying to do those three functions in those three zones and play around with how to do that. So the Gbbr Inc., which is the convener organization for this, has a vision to be an international model of sustainability for the Eastern Georgian Bay while protecting the ecological values of those regions. The mission is really to facilitate cooperative action in support of the conservation of biodiversity and sustainable development through education and public outreach, with the hopes that this will foster a shared responsibility for the Georgian Bay Biosphere Reserve area for the next 7 generations. And I'd note that this is a Gbbr Inc., but I like reminding folks that the Biosphere Reserve designation is not owned by the convener organization. This is a community effort and a community activity that builds and supports the ongoing designation as a biosphere reserve. So we try not to see ourselves as owning this designation, rather that we share it with all of our partners. And it's that sharing process that requires work, always. On the conservation front, this started for the Biosphere Reserve in early days with conservation stakeholder workshops. We were the new kid on the block. We didn't want to step on other people's toes. We wanted to learn from others, and we still don't want to step on people's toes, frankly. But what we learned from those conservation stakeholder workshops was really there's a lot going on in the landscape, and there was a lot going on in the landscape in those days. But there is, at the same time, a lot going on that others didn't know about. There's duplication, there's inefficiencies, just lack of awareness. And out of that came one of the first project ideas, or larger project ideas that we can focus on today, which would be the State of the Bay Environmental Report Card. And I hope everybody has seen the report card, and the next one's coming out in 2 more seasons. The State of the Bay Report Card, sure, first sort of peg at that is it's a state of the health. We're trying to tell the story about what the ecological condition of this landscape is. But I think that the State of the Bay is much more than that. As a project area, what we're doing as a group of organizations and government is really inventorying what research and monitoring activities are happening on the coast. And by doing that, letting us know what the gaps in our understanding and knowledge are, so we can begin to refocus efforts and gather that knowledge. So it's an inventory and a gap. But the other one, when we started out with the State of the Bay report card in the last one, is that we wanted to make sure that more than a scientific document that would come out and then just launch itself back onto the shelf because it wasn't interesting to read, is we wanted to engage the public. We want to educate the public, build a sense of pride and awareness about what this landscape means, akin to, Carl, what you were doing today for us. So we're trying to build pride, awareness, communication pieces that engage the public while also being scientifically accurate and building in us an awareness of where we need to work next. So I mentioned it's a community effort. So within the State of the Bay report card, we have the work of the Georgian Bay Land Trust and its terrestrial land stewardship. And the work of the NACP will be very helpful in helping us define the health of the terrestrial ecosystem. You have the work of the Eastern Georgian Bay Stewardship Council and the Upper Great Lakes Management Unit looking at fisheries stewardship and fisheries monitoring on the coast, all pulling into a knowledge base about how we're doing on the coast. Georgian Bay Forever with its research, water quality monitoring, DNA barcoding, very exciting, its wetlands work, lots of research, all coming to bear into this, this project of building an understanding of where we're at on the coast and what work needs to be done, and culminating really in the state of the bay. So that's the glossy document. David Bywater in the center picture here has really been coordinating this project with our staff and with the partners. And what I'm always amazed at when I go and talk to David is the wealth of knowledge and the wealth of activities that exists on this coast that most of us aren't aware of. And it's incredible. The work from Environment Canada, Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Natural Resources, First Nations research work in different areas on the coast, municipalities and the work that they're doing. There is a lot of work going on, and we feel that the State of the Bay report card, or the State of the Bay project, is really an important component of kind of pooling that and inventorying that and tracking what that information is. But in other ways, the State of the Bay acts so that when somebody wants a piece of information or wants to know who I can work with, David will get a call or I'll get an email and be like, I'm going to be up in this area and I can't get out. How do I get there? And it's those less tangible aspects of partnership and collaboration that come out of working together like this. So David Sweetenham had Julia out on the Georgian Bay Keeper boat. So the advantages of partnerships in these multiple organizations, I think, are really well demonstrated in things like the State of the Bay. Moving on to one of our flagship programs, the Species at Risk, and this work will continue, is that State of the Bay is sort of an overview type thing. Species at Risk gets us working very specifically on the ground with things. And it's an example of a project where the Biosphere Reserve, when we were first scanning the landscape of activities on the coast, found that there wasn't a lot of work being done on species at risk. And so, and not really other organizations wanting to at that time pick it up and run with it. So we did. And many of you, I hope, have met Glenda Clayton, who's our primary species at risk educator. But the work that we've done on species at risk has ranged from very, very broad education of cottagers and permanent residents, but to very specific work with, say, the highway crews up and down the Highway 400 corridor, training them how to recognize, identify, and safely move rattlesnakes off their work sites. Working with mitigation measures in terms of the highway and monitoring the effectiveness of those mitigation measures so we can improve mitigation measures on roads going forward. So when we focus on a species, any individual species at risk, we're able to not only protect that species, but take a look at the habitat needs that they have and aggregate that into a bit of a landscape protection. And so we'll continue to look at species at risk because they teach us about how to protect the landscape. It's a message that First Nations and Indigenous communities on the coast are continuing to teach us as a Biosphere Reserve about communications and education, and it's invaluable to us. Sustainable development's a bit of a gnarly concept because what it asks us to do as a Biosphere Reserve and as an area is to focus on the economic well-being of our communities, the ecological needs of our coast, the cultural component that ties and binds our communities together. So those three pillars of sustainable development. And you can't really do one without any of the other. So we try to provide examples of this and work on sustainable development activities. And they blur the line, sustainable development and conservation. We end up blurring the line. So some of you, I think, would have been exposed to the Life on the Bay stewardship workshops, the Love Your Lake shoreline assessments that have happened in Honey Harbor and also in many areas of the township of the Archipelago over recent years. And then over the last couple of years, a stewardship incentive program, which was actually a partnership with the Dufferin-Simcoe Conservation or Stewardship Group. All of this is sustainable development work. This is work that's modifying how we look at, how we behave on our landscape. It's modifying our built activities and our behaviors. That's sustainable development. It's to benefit ecology. We're trying to reduce our ecological footprint, but this is sustainable development work in my view. So that you're probably familiar with this from a cottage audience, but from a local community group, one of the things you may not be aware of is the communities up and down the coast of Georgian Bay, and including First Nation communities, have household incomes that are well below provincial averages. So these are individuals and households that are striving to make a living, striving to bring food into their homes in many respects. And so one small project that we started with community groups in Parry Sound was a community gardening activity, where we have 70 garden plots where community members go and maintain and grow food, and then 20% of that gets redirected into Harvest Share, so food banks. Similar activities that we have, again, in partnership with community members is around healthy foods and helping educate about how to budget for healthy foods and bake healthy foods. So that kind of, until we ensure, or as we ensure that we have sustainable livelihoods in our communities, until that happens or while that happens, we are trying to grow a passion for Georgian Bay. And I can tell you that the people that are up and down the coast have a passion for Georgian Bay, but they can't always focus on just the ecology. They also need to focus on livelihoods. So much of our work is education, and Ken, you made me blush, so thank you for the kudos. But education is key for us, and it's key for the communities. And so much of the work that all the GB5 and other organizations and associations are doing are really about trying to grow a pride of place and a knowledge about what we're trying to protect. So we've done water festivals with grade 5 and 6 students. We have a lot of lessons in a backpack, which are actually in-school curriculum programs that allow teachers to get their kids outside of the schoolyard and learn about the Biosphere Reserve. We've worked with First Nations educators, and really we're learning with them, and we're learning how to be better partners with First Nations on education. And one of the UNESCO mandates asks us to work with our Indigenous cultures better. When we take a look at a high level of the future needs and opportunities on this coast, specifically to Georgian Bay Biosphere Reserve, I think we have an opportunity and a need to better engage our communities in the direction of the Georgian Bay Biosphere Reserve, and looking at the strategic directions for that Biosphere Reserve, and continue to do that. I think there's a real need to look at public communications. Bob, when you point out the pressures from the south, is that, well, right now we're communicating a lot to the people that are up on Georgian Bay, but the pressures are in the south. And so we have, I think, as a group of organizations, we need to look at how and what we're communicating about our area. I think there's an opportunity for increased coordination and collaboration between the organizations. The State of the Bay is a prime example that I could draw on. I think there's a benefit to the organizations, and I'm hugely impressed by the work that these many organizations have done. On the education side of things, as Gbbr, we're challenged by finding sustainable funding specifically for getting our staff into schools. And it's one of the reasons that we've gone for charitable status. The other thing, and this is where I actually meant to go with increased coordination and collaboration, is that sustainable development is about having hard conversations. It's about having those conversations about trading off between our different values and about moving and shifting our values. And I think all of us have to learn about how to have those hard conversations. And we have some tools, and we have tools in the room today, and that's awesome. But I think collectively over the next 100 years, we can figure out how to do and have those conversations better. And I don't have the answers, because that's for the next 100 years. Thanks very much.